fun. Man, it was awesome. We had 3 kids that gave their life to the Lord, surrendered their lives, which is huge. Yeah. We had another 14 who rededicated their lives. The truth is, many found clarity with God this past week. Some did go into camp questioning where God is in the midst of the brokenness. Others went in feeling insignificant and insecure about the future. And then God showed up. Our kids experienced God's overwhelming love, and they learned they were made for a purpose, just as you and I are made for a purpose. Now, if you find this truth hard to believe, or if you question God's presence in your life, I'm very glad you're here this morning. My hope is before we leave, you'll have a better understanding of God's goodness and God's God-given calling on your life. To help us in this pursuit, we're going to look through the book of Esther. That's where our theme verse came from. And we're going to be reading here in a second. If you're in your physical Bible, we'll have the scriptures up on the screen. Or if you're in the Bible app, Pastor Trey has put all the scriptures right there for you. Before we start reading, I do want to share a little bit of history to help us frame the story of Esther. If you'll recall, King David was the greatest king of Israel. He ruled a unified nation around 1000 BC, yet sadly, most of the kings after him were scoundrels. They were so bad, eventually Israel split into 2 countries, Israel being in the north and Judah being in the south. In 722, it got so bad that Assyrians conquered Israel in the north, and then later in 586 BC, Judah was defeated. The Babylonians were the world power, and people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were deported to Babylon. Then, ultimately, Persia overtook the Babylonians, and they reigned that world at that time. From Africa to India, they were the world power. Esther's story took place during Persia's reign in 480 BC, about 20 years before Ezra returned to Jerusalem, and about 30 years before Nehemiah returned to rebuild the walls after he served in Susa, which was the capital of Persia. Susa, it's now in present-day Iran. That's where King Xerxes ruled his vast, vast kingdom. Yet apparently it wasn't vast enough. He wanted more. Like many dictators, he wanted to rule the world. His father had lost a key battle in Greece known as the Battle of Marathon. You runners, you should know something about that. As a result, Xerxes was ready to avenge the loss and take on Alexander the Great on his home turf. First, though, he needed to rally his troops. He needed to consolidate his power. So what did he do? He threw a huge party, a 6-month party. Esther 1:4 tells us that they partied for a full 180 days, and Xerxes displayed his vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. There was no humble bragging with this guy. He flaunted his stuff. He flaunted everything he had, including, or at least he tried to flaunt, his wife, Queen Vashti. After the 6-month party, Xerxes decided to have a 7-day banquet alongside Vashti's separate party. He got liquored up, and he called on his wife Vashti to come and show off her good looks in front of all his guests. Now, when I was looking at this, I never knew, but some scholars think he called her to come in her crown alone. Whether that's true or not, Vashti wasn't having it for obvious reasons. She did not want to be objectified by a bunch of drunken men. Unfortunately, though, her refusal did not look good for Xerxes and his consolidation efforts. Therefore, he banned her from his presence forever as a warning to all the other ladies in the kingdom. At first, Xerxes was happy with this decree. However, as time went on, he began to have second guesses, like many people after a bad breakup. In chapter 2, we find out later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king." The king's attendants understood his urges probably weren't best for PR purposes. So they decided to host the very first episode of The Bachelor Persian edition, right? Right? There's nothing new under the sun. This was where Esther enters the scene. Esther was a beautiful young lady who had connections in the palace. Since both of Esther's parents were dead, she was put in the care of Mordecai, her cousin. Mordecai, along with Esther, was a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, and he had some kind of clout or official role because he was allowed to roam freely around the king's gate. We don't know for sure if Mordecai's position helped Esther during this kingdom-wide beauty pageant, but it doesn't matter. Esther was selected. Whether she wanted to be there or not, she got in with many other gorgeous young women, virgins. And all these virgins had 12 months to prep themselves with beauty treatments, cosmetics, perfume, before each one of them had one shot, one evening with the king. In chapter 2, verse 15, we read, "When the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any other woman, and she found his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." Esther won this twisted courting challenge by winning the favor of the king. Now, if she didn't win the fantasy sweet night, she would have been a concubine like everyone else. Instead, she became queen 4 years after Vashti was outed. Doesn't this feel like a Disney story up to this point, a Cinderella type story? Life is good. That is until Haman entered the picture. Haman was the antagonist, a descendant of the Amalekites. His ancestry may not mean much to you. It meant something to the Jews, though. The Amalekites were the people who attacked the Jews after they left Egypt. Upon their exodus, they did the Passover, God worked, they fled, and they were attacked by the Amalekites. Obviously, God wasn't happy about it, so later he commanded Saul, the first king of Israel, another Benjaminite. He challenged him, he commanded him to punish the Amalekites by totally destroying them, all the people, all the animals. Unfortunately, Saul disobeyed. He couldn't see what God was talking about. He concluded genocide wasn't necessary in this case. And so out of that remnant came Haman. If Saul would have done what he was supposed to, Haman would have never happened. So he rose to power. When I say rose, I mean it. He ranked higher than any other Persian official, probably second only to Xerxes, which meant all the other royal officials were required to bow to Haman, even Mordecai. Given the history of the Amalekites and the Jews, you know Mordecai didn't bow down. And when he didn't, Haman was enraged, especially when he found out his ethnicity. Consequently, Haman wanted Mordecai and every Jew along with him dead. In chapter 3, we see, verse 6, it says, "Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the poor, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar." Verse 8, "Then Haman said to King Xerxes, 'There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I'll pay you some dough. I'll give you 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury.'" And then listen to this in verse 10. "So the king took his signet ring from his finger, gave it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews." That was easy. Xerxes didn't push back much against Haman's conniving ways, did he? He seemed rather cool and flippant as he gave Haman the okay. History tells us that Xerxes had already squashed 2 revolts, one in Egypt and one in Babylon. So maybe he was just playing it safe when it came to taking out the Jews. We don't know. But we do know he made the edict not knowing his order would affect his lovely bride. As a side note, it is interesting how Haman determined the date of the Jewish extermination. He cast the poor in order to make a selection by lot. Basically, 5 or 6 years into Esther's reign, Haman threw the dice to determine when his lottery prize would be realized. You can imagine the horrors of the Jewish people thinking about Haman in his decree. In many ways, Haman was the prelude to Hitler and Hitler's final solution. We've all seen the footage from World War II, the despair of the Nazi camps and the fear of those who were hiding for those many years. That's the kind of terror the Jews dealt with, knowing their destruction would come in 11 months. Now, this was no bueno for Mordecai. He immediately took it upon himself to relay this message to Esther in hopes that she would make an appeal to Xerxes. Esther, on the other hand, she wasn't as antsy to take her news before the king, for good reason. She told Mordecai she would die without being summoned by Xerxes, unless, of course, he extended his scepter. Mordecai was unfazed. He wasn't having it. And this is where his famous pep talk, the K theme verse, comes into view. We'll start in Esther 4:12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family, you're going to perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." I absolutely love his speech. I love his confidence in God. He knew God would intervene in one way or another. He knew God was sovereign regardless of Esther's response. God didn't need Esther. At the same time, he knew hiding out in the palace would not save her or her family. So he helped her see how her placement within the palace could actually position her to act on God's behalf. He helped her see there was no neutral ground. I'm sure she was thinking about self-preservation and didn't want to rock the boat. But y'all, her silence would equate to condoning the injustice if she didn't act. This is what what Mordecai was telling her. And deep down, Esther knew he was right. That's why he told Mordecai to go. That's why she told Mordecai to go and gather all the Jews there in Susa and fast for her. She said, "Do not eat or drink for 3 days. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." I also love Esther's response here. She turned to God in her fear and asked the Jews to fast, a very smart move on her part. So many great movements in the Bible are preceded by prayer and fasting. Think about Moses before he received the 10 Commandments, Jehoshaphat before his great military victory in 2 Chronicles, Jesus before he overcame temptation in the wilderness, the apostles before they commissioned Paul and Barnabas in Acts 13. The list goes on and on. Fasting has and will always be a key part for all of us believers. You see, Esther wasn't trying to manipulate God. She was looking for support to endure whatever God had for her, whether that meant she perished or whether that meant she found favor. And thankfully, favor was found. She went before the king, and by God's graces, Xerxes extended not only his scepter, but he extended a willingness to grant her whatever she asked for, up to half the kingdom. She didn't want half the kingdom, though. At that moment, all Esther wanted was for the king, along with Haman, to come to the banquet she had prepared. Sounded easy enough. So the king summoned Haman. They went, and again the king asked Esther her request. He was full. He was ready to grant wishes. And this again was Esther's chance to stop the attack on her people, to squash it. Yet what did she do? She asked the fellows to come back the next day for another banquet. Oh, what a letdown. Was Esther scared? Was she timid? Probably. Insecure? I don't know. But no worries, because God was still working behind the scenes. He had a plan. After the banquet, Haman left, he was feeling himself. He immediately started bragging about his wealth, all his sons, and his exclusive invite to the banquet. The dude had it all. Still, all the wealth, all the fame couldn't bring him peace and contentment. We know this because on his way home, he saw Mordecai, and Mordecai showed no reverence for his presence. And he blew a gasket. He lost it. That's the power of pride and hate. It keeps you from being content with the blessings you do have. Sadly, Haman wouldn't be content until Mordecai was dead. As a result, that night he set up a huge pole out in the courtyard, and hopefully the king would allow him to impale Mordecai on it the next day. That was what he was hoping for. That's what he was praying for. Speaking of the king couldn't sleep either, for whatever reason. Maybe he was thinking about the rationale behind the banquet. Maybe he questioned why Haman was invited. Maybe he suspected an affair. We don't know. Nevertheless, the king couldn't sleep, and they didn't have NyQuil. They didn't have the Audible app, and so he woke up one of his servants and said, "You read to me." A horrible job. Wake up in the middle of the night, and you got to read me a book. And not just any book, a book of Chronicles, which basically consists of dates and names and events during Xerxes' reign. All right, so this is a boring task, and maybe that was the point. Well, as he was reading, wouldn't you know it, his servant just so happened to read about the time Mordecai exposed the assassination plot of 2 officers within the king's court. It turned out Mordecai was never honored for his good deed. Furthermore, it just so happened Xerxes heard Haman out in the outer court and called him in, where he had probably just finished erecting that pole. Xerxes asked him advice on how he should honor a person he delights in. So naturally, Haman thinks the king's talking about himself. So he answered. There in chapter 6, verse 7, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with the royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on a horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Whew, a jaw-dropping moment here. He didn't think much about that. I think he was planning that. The king said, "I love it. Go and do as you said. And you know what? While you're at it, you lead him through the streets on the noble steed, proclaiming, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Wow. I bet this scene was on Jesus' mind when he later said, "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." That was the humbling turning point for Haman, to say the least. That was the beginning of the end. Thereafter, everything happened really fast. Haman was summoned to Esther's second banquet, and that's where Esther finally responded to the king's offer. Verse 3, "Then the queen answered, 'If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated.'" Needless to say, Xerxes was furious. He asked, "Who would dare do such a thing?" This time, Esther didn't mince her words. She proclaimed boldly in verse 6, "An adversary and enemy, the vile Haman." Xerxes didn't know what to do with himself. He just left in a rage. In response, Haman threw himself on Esther's couch and begged for mercy. Not wise. No one was supposed to get within a certain distance of the queen. So when Xerxes came back into the room and saw Haman close to Esther, he assumed the worst. It was the death sentence for Haman, and not just any death. Ironically, he was impaled on the very same pole he set up for Mordecai. Y'all, let this be a reminder to those of us who are plotting revenge, or if we have just bitterness and vengeance in our hearts. In this life, you will reap what you sow. Haman sowed bitterness and anger, and he reaped the anger of the king. He plotted Mordecai's death and received death on the very instrument of torture he had set up. And the crazy thing is, Mordecai was promoted to Haman's position, and he and Esther took over his whole estate. Psalm 7 says, "Whoever is pregnant with evil conceives trouble and gives birth to disillusionment. Whoever digs a hole and scoops it out falls into the pit they have made. The trouble they cause recoils on them. Their violence comes down on their very own heads." This is a picture of what happened to Haman. Haman got what was coming to him. Unfortunately, his demise didn't fit everything. The future of the Jews was still in jeopardy. The king's edict was still very much in play, which meant Esther still had work to do. Therefore, she went back to the king and pleaded with the king. This is his response in Esther 8. "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring can be revoked." I don't know about y'all, but the king's response seemed passive and vague to me. It was like he was saying, "Hey, I killed Haman for you. I can't do anything about his decree. What else do you want from me? Hey, y'all go and take care of this. Here's my ring. Do what you're going to do." If that was his mentality, he did have a point. According to the law of the Persians, any law sealed by the king's signet ring could not be nullified. So what did Mordecai and Esther do? They circumvented the original law by establishing a new edict which allowed the Jews to defend themselves. Now, the Jews would have fought back regardless, with or without the edict. But the new decree was huge because it let the rest of the world know that the palace had the backs of the Jews, meaning it wouldn't be wise for foreign leaders to aid in any Jewish attack. As it turned out, all the nobles and government leaders were wise. With a healthy fear of Mordecai's newfound power, they helped the Jews defend themselves, and on the 13th and 14th of Adar, the Jews killed at least 500 of their attackers and 10 of Haman's sons. The tables were turned, and the Jews were saved. How about that? There is your happy ever after. Amen. To this day, Jews around the world still celebrate the festival of Purim annually. Kids dress up in their costumes. They carry around their toy scepters. The story of Esther is read, and people celebrate their deliverance, all because a young lady realized she was made for a time such as that. All because she cast her lot with God. She took her chances with God and not with Haman and not with her feelings of fear and insecurity. Y'all, this is such a powerful story. And yet there's so many people, including kids, at the camp we went to that don't even know this is in the Bible. Man, the lessons we can learn from this. There's a lot of applications. I do want to point out just two quick applications that we can glean. One, like Esther, you are called for a time such as this. As a believer, you are called by God to be His ambassador for this specific time and place. You see, you are not an accident. Where you reside is not by chance. Where you work is not by chance. You say, I don't like my work. Well, that's okay. You don't always have to like your work, but God has a purpose. God has placed you in your current position for a season and for a reason. Who knows? Maybe God wants someone in your work to know about His salvation, and you're the one to speak up. You're the only Bible, you're the only light, you're the only salt in that place that will have the guts and the boldness to bring them to God's goodness. Maybe God has you in your community for a reason and for a season so you can intercede for a group of people, a group that is underprivileged, a group that doesn't have a voice at the table, a group that is hurting. You can be an Esther wherever you're living. Amen. You say, I'm not qualified. Don't give me that. God chose you before the foundations of this world for good works. You are His masterpiece. He predestined you to be in this moment. If any of your ancestors would have died, you may not be here, but He protected your line, and you are here for a reason. If you have hope, that qualifies you. You don't need a seminary degree. When Jesus saved the woman at the well, she didn't wait 2 years to get her act together before she shared. She shared immediately. Same with the demonic man in Mark 5. The healed blind man in John 9. He didn't have all the answers. He just knew he was once blind, but he could see thanks to Jesus. Y'all, God has prepared you for this moment. If you've been healed, you have hope. And as a hope giver, as salt and light, it is your job to confront the injustice around you. We can't remain silent. That's not going to save you or your family. Granted, we can't attack every form of injustice, but if God has given you a righteous anger for some kind of injustice, hey, act on it. If you're going to err on the side of action. Amen. Don't be silent. You were made for a time such as this. Lastly, if you take nothing else from this morning, remember, we serve a sovereign God. You may or may not know this, but God's name is not mentioned once in the book of Esther. Nonetheless, it's not hard to see His fingerprints throughout the whole book. Too many things happened for this to be coincidence. Today, people would say, well, the universe came together and they intervened in Esther's situation. We know better than that. God is always working behind the scenes, particularly during the storms and the trials of life. We don't have to cry out in fear as the disciples did when the storm hit the Sea of Galilee. Jesus was in the boat with them. We can trust God's going to see us through. We can trust His sovereignty. We can trust God works out all things for our good, one way or another, even if that means death. To live is Christ and to die is gain. We can trust God. He is the ultimate director of this life. On the way home, I was talking to a student about Top Gun. It seems like everyone and their dog has seen that. I'm willing to bet, for those of you who saw it, no one walked out of the theater in the middle of the movie when times seemed dire. We stayed, we watched because we knew the director had a plan. Y'all, God has a plan for your life. Let the movie play out. Let Him use you. Trust Him. Amen. Remember, you were called for a time such as this, and God is sovereign. You can trust Him. If you've never put your trust in Him, this morning you have an opportunity to do just that. Our kids last week, they came forward and they realized they needed to repent. Maybe this morning you're like Haman. Maybe you are consumed with bitterness. Maybe you're all about the famous life and wealth and things. And you're realizing that's not giving me what I want. Y'all, Jesus came to give His life and life to the full. He came to give us abundance. Choose abundance this morning. Put your trust in Him. Maybe you're here this morning and you have put your faith in Jesus, but you need to come forward and ask God to help you put your trust in Him by acting out in obedience. It's one thing to be enlightened. It's one thing to be convicted. But if you don't act on that, y'all, that's disobedience. That's remaining silent. So if God has put something on your heart and you haven't had the boldness to act on it, man, find someone. Come and pray with the elders. Pray with Pastor Mike. Let's don't walk in disobedience anymore. Let's don't walk in silence. Let's be the people God has created us to be.